For links to the audio and video versions of the Industrial Software Podcast, as well as a newsletter sign up, you can always head to ManufactureSoft.com. You can also reach out by email to contact@ManufactureSoft.com. Thanks, and let's get into the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Industrial Software Podcast. I have with me today James Meads from ProcurementSoftware.site. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kevin. Pleasure to be on, and really intrigued by what we're going to talk about today. So looking forward to it. My background is in working in manufacturing businesses, so this should be fun.
Very cool. So yeah, if you want to give our audience just a quick primer on what ProcurementSoftware.site is.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, so ProcurementSoftware.site is essentially a website that is a directory of different procurement tech companies. What I found was that there was really missing out there on the market was just a simple functionality website to be able to go on and break down the different types of procurement SaaS that are out there based on a number of different criteria that the searcher could be looking for, and the searcher typically being a head of procurement or perhaps even a CFO or a boutique consultancy in certain instances.
Yep. And I think you also do kind of work with procurement startups some, as well as procurement teams directly. Do you want to kind of explain a little bit how you work with those two sides of the table?
Right, yeah. So the business model essentially in terms of any consulting work that I do is on the one side, on the one hand, I help heads of procurement or perhaps CFOs or CEOs in smaller businesses to search and find the right procurement software that reflects the needs and wishes of their organization. And then on the other hand, I work with procurement tech startups to help them with their product and positioning and content marketing to help them resonate with the audience that they're trying to attract as potential buyers. So I work on both sides of the aisle, but tendency is more towards working more with the startups now and building that out.
In terms of just getting going, I thought to paint the picture, it would be a good start, maybe for myself as well as our audience, to pick a hypothetical of I'm at a company, I need to buy something. Let's say I got to buy wood, a material. Why don't you just walk us through what that entails? Let's start off, who at the company is doing this? And I'm guessing it's different based on different types of companies and company size. But in this hypothetical, who tends to be doing this? Well, let's say a small company and a medium-sized company and a big company, Right.
Okay. So in a small company, then it will typically be whoever's buying the wood will typically be either the operations manager or whoever's responsible for production planning. And if that's a sawmill, it can be something very, very simple. Whereas, if it's a big industrial scale furniture manufacturing company, then it's obviously going to be a lot more complex. And, in any organization that's sort of a medium size and upwards, I'm using very rough numbers here, but if a business is doing, $20-25 million in revenue and above, they're probably going to have someone in some way, shape or form that's doing the buying that is not just doing it as a side part of their job. So it's not going to be the guy that runs the factory or that ships the end product. So if there is a procurement team or department, even if it's just one person as a buyer, what usually happens is that the department that is responsible for or that has the budget for buying the wood essentially hands over that money and that responsibility to the buyer to be able to then go out and source, negotiate, contract in certain instances, depending on the complexity, with a wood supplier or a lumberjack firm, or depending on the complexity and the grade of wood that they're buying. I guess I've never bought wood, but so the procurement professional is essentially the commercial expert that understands sourcing, contracts, commercial terms, usually the basic market tendencies of the commodity or the product that they're buying, and the internal stakeholder that's using or consuming the wood is essentially the person that has the budget and in most cases will be able to tell you the specifications, the quantities, the qualities, the delivery terms that they want, the call-offs, anything around operations, production planning, that type of thing. So in a very, very simple term, operations or engineering define what they want, and procurement goes out and secures it and goes out and buys it and selects the vendor.
So my guess is that the like multi-decade trend in this has been in the outset, it's phone calls, handshakes, relationships, and it's increasingly trending towards company to company, computer system to computer system purchasing. Am I correct with that overarching assessment?
That's right. And maybe the example of wood was a bad example because, that's typically, in a lot of cases going to be quite old school traditional industries, but in more complex manufacturing, let's take, I don't know, automotive or consumer goods or something like that, then yeah, you're going to have a business is going to be running some sort of enterprise resourcing planning ERP system, once they're above a certain size. Even if they're only a tiny company, they're going to have some sort of finance and accounting system that somehow has to match, what's been ordered and what's been received against what's been invoiced, to make sure that otherwise, in theory, any Tom, Dick or Harry could send an invoice to the company and then call up accounts and say, why haven't you paid me? So there has to be some sort of control and process to ensure that doesn't happen. And that in its most basic form is, the fraud protection mechanisms that most companies have in place.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the software that these folks would be using. One particular thing that I was interested in is, I know that a lot of pieces of software highlight supplier discovery. How often are you the one going out and manually finding where you can source your materials, versus how often does the software make it apparent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, there is software out there on the market now that does exactly that. We would call it supplier scouting software, because it's not classic sourcing software in the sense that you want the software to actually go out and do a bit of it. It essentially works. It scrapes the internet, right? So it scrapes the internet. So if in, I don't know how it works in the US, but in Europe, in most countries, we have, national or regional, provincial company registers. So it can do things like scrape all of the registered companies in a certain country or state. It can also search website directories. It can search things like members of chambers of commerce and that type of thing. So depending on what you're looking for, it can then spit out a short list of X number of potential suppliers for a given commodity or product. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't do any sort of due diligence or background checks or anything like that on the company. In its most basic form, it might be able to check that the company is valid and registered, and if they have a website, it will be able to find that. But it doesn't do any sort of, doesn't do any quality checks. It doesn't check if they've got any legislation or any legal actions against them. So it does the basic upstream part of finding vendors if you're searching for a product or service where you as the buyer literally have no clue who to buy it from, or maybe you do have one or two suppliers, but you want to go out and market test and you don't know who their competitors are. Then it's a great tool for doing the upstream part of that. But it in no way does it replace a human in terms of being able to do the end-to-end buying process.
Okay. So if a human does want to do that, how do they typically approach doing that? It's got to be a lot of just legwork and like manually.
It is, and that's why these software solutions are such a great driver of value in terms of taking out a lot of the grunt work. So they will never replace a procurement professional in their entirety. But if you've got a procurement professional that's earning $100K a year and they're spending a lot of time on Google or in traditional supplier directories, like online versions of the Yellow Pages back in the day, that's not a good use of a knowledge worker's time. So the real value proposition of these software solutions isn't to replace a person, a full-time employee. It's really to make their life simpler, so as a lot of the legwork can be saved, and that particular person can spend more time doing value added activities rather than something that you can teach a robot to do in this case.
You mentioned supplier directories. Just as a learning experience, it would be really helpful to like dig through them myself. Do you have like a like a suggestion of, oh yeah, go look at X or Y or Z supplier directory, like what I would look for to find that?
Well, just like what we're doing on ProcurementSoftware.site, if you take that more broadly into the complete SaaS ecosystem, then companies like Capterra or GetApp or Software Finder are a broad directory of apps and software as a service. And you've got similar types of directories, somewhat more low tech, for things like purchase parts and commodities and components. And you've got industrial manufacturing directories based on location or based on industry sector that do a similar job that would have maybe 30, 40 years ago been a catalog that are now online directories. The problem with those is they often rely on the companies themselves to update their data. So, if you've got a directory of say 10,000 companies that make furniture or that make castings and forgings, if those companies that are registered in there are not actively getting leads from that directory, then it doesn't take a genius to figure out that they're probably not going to spend too much time updating their profile. And the result of that, I've used them, here in Europe, maybe in the US they're a bit more reliable, but oftentimes, the email addresses bounce, the phone numbers are out of date, they don't make what they say they make because the data in there is probably 10 years old from when they first registered on the site and it's never been updated. So they are very occasionally you'll find a diamond in the rough there and you'll find a really good supplier from these directories, but often the data in them is just absolute garbage because it's not kept up to date.
All of these inefficiencies and inaccuracies and things like that really sound like opportunities. I mean, because it's extraordinary value that you can create if you can create a directory like this that doesn't have these holes punched in it. And so my guess is this is the ultimate master plan of about 5,000 startups in the space. Their thinking is, well, we'll start here, we'll start small, and then eventually our company will be the end all be all single source of truth for true information for what's available. First off, is that true? And second, do there seem to be emerging winners who could capture this and actually make this not opaque?
Yeah, there are two sort of front runners that are in this space that are essentially playing to be, a single source of truth that pushes supplier vendor master data to different procurement systems that they integrate with. There's a Canadian company called Tealbook and a German company called Scout B that are very much playing in this space, and they are direct competitors with what they're trying to do. For all sense and purposes, they're offering a very similar product, albeit with a different slant and quite different marketing. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the goal is that they want to be essentially a single global supplier database that can push that data into something like an SAP or whatever you might be using as an ERP system to ensure that you as the buyer or as the finance department don't have to update that supplier data manually or rely on the suppliers to do it, which is great if you just need basic data to be able to validate that the supplier is located where they say they're located, and that that their company registration number is up to date, and that they've filed their accounts and everything like that. What it doesn't do is provide any more detailed quality or environmental certification. So if you're a food manufacturer, for example, you need to get details around their food hygiene certification, or if you're an automotive if you're an OEM in the automotive industry, you need to make sure that your tier one suppliers have things like ISO 14001, which is basic environmental standards that pretty much every major OEM demands from its supply base. So they don't do that, because they can't be all things to all people. So it really depends what you want to get from it. If it's making sure that your basic data that you're maintaining on your suppliers is correct to be able to pay them and to be able to contact them in times of a black swan event like COVID, for example, then 100%. But if you're relying on it as a single source of truth for all of your raw material suppliers going into a finished product that require additional quality or environmental certifications, then it definitely won't do that. And you will need something more specialist to do that.
So let's take Tealbook as a hard example of, an entrant in this space that's really catching on. Is the end game of something like that to, like, as you said, plug into SAP, and so users would not directly be using its UI, or is its end goal to subvert SAP and become the new SAP and people like live inside of Tealbook?
Yeah, I don't think it will ever take over what an ERP system does, because something like SAP doesn't just cover purchasing and operations planning and finance. It covers everything, right? It's a whole enterprise resource planning system. What I do think what it will do and what it is doing essentially. I mean, I've met Tealbook CEO personally, actually, so I know a bit more about them than maybe some others. They do integrate with some of the big source to pay suites or platforms out there. So as when any company implements any type of procurement tech, one of the biggest challenges is that, especially larger organizations, is that their data is garbage, because sales data historically has always been pretty well maintained in an organization. Every company knows what they sell. Very, very few companies truly understand what they buy. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Ownership of data, the fact that companies generally tend to have more suppliers than they do customers, unless they're a B2C e-commerce company. There are a number of reasons why purchasing or procurement data has traditionally been quite messy. But yes, that is what something like a Tealbook is doing at the moment. It does integrate with some of these large source-to-pay platforms. I'm just thinking, I think they already integrate with iValua and Jagger. I'm not sure if they integrate with Cooper and Ariba, which are the two biggest ones. I'd have to check that. But yeah, they've definitely got some partnerships with some of the big ones, with the very intention that it solves a big pushback or a big bottleneck of implementing this software or getting successful results from it. If you put garbage in, you get garbage out, and something like a Tealbook then claims to solve that. Whether it does or not in reality, I couldn't say, but that's certainly what they're selling as the USP, and in theory it should do.
I'm a little bit curious about the suite solutions. Do most companies have one of these up and running and have had it for decades and all of that? Or is even that still kind of like a new frontier? Like, a lot of companies have a haphazard solution for this and haven't implemented an overarching suite solution.
So it's definitely not a new solution. It's definitely pretty old hat in terms of technology, but I would say that it's not been widely adopted below sort of Fortune 500 companies. We're still on the upward trajectory of the bell curve in terms of even getting basic source to pay or procure to pay technology, which doesn't really touch manufacturing. It's more a procurement and accounting type of problem that solves. Although it does indirectly impact manufacturing. That if you've not got good data and good technology, then suppliers don't get paid on time because bank details are incorrect, lead times are wrong, payment terms are incorrect, which all can then impact on production. A lot of the time where the procurement spends running around fixing operational issues is usually at its core down to the fact that the data in the system is rubbish. But yeah, to go back to your question, no, it's not widely adopted beyond Fortune 500 companies. The next frontier actually is the mid-market. And a lot of these legacy suites, in my personal opinion, are not really fit for function in that market because they are quite complex. They're not very user-friendly. They're built on a pretty old tech stack, especially some of the earliest ones like SAP Ariba probably being the best example that, their tech essentially stems from the late 1990s. Yes, it's been updated, but, it's a very old platform that it came from. So where I see the opportunity now is really, if you're a mid-sized business, and that's, you can define that how you will, and it depends on the size of the market. But let's just say, if you're a $200-300 million business and you want to implement some basic procurement technology in the source to pay or procure to pay space, there are a plethora of options right now, and a lot of them now, especially the best of breed and the newer ones, are focused on app first technology and really focusing on the UX, both for the end user and also for the supplier, because typically procurement has adopted it and in some cases grudgingly used it, even if the UX is a bit crappy. But often, if you've got a stakeholder, if you've got a maintenance engineer coming out of the production plant covered in oil and they need to order something, they're not going to log on to SAP and figure out, which magic commander they have to give so as SAP doesn't scratch its head and say no. They just want an Amazon-like experience that they can go on somewhere and buy something. And the newer best of breed technology solves that beyond, just the old hat solution of having punch out catalogs, which does have a place in that, but not everything can be purchased through a punch out catalog. If you've got a one-off piece of equipment or a service that you need to buy, you can't go into an MRO or an office stationery catalog and just go in and buy that. So, very long answer to a quick question, but no, the technology still isn't widely adopted, although you do wonder why when, the payback and the ROI is so obvious in terms of all of the grunt work and operational problems that it fixes.
Real quick, let's define best of breed and MRO for our audience who might not know. So best of breed is something I've heard referenced quite a bit, but how would you sum that up?
Yeah, so best of breed versus a suite. So a suite would typically be a piece of procurement technology that would try and solve, the end-to-end requirements of what procurement does. So it would have a sourcing module, it would have a purchase to pay module, it would have a contract repository module of some description. It might even have some basic spend analytics functionality. Whereas a best of breed is something that typically focuses on solving one problem particularly well. So, for example, having an all singing, all dancing best of breed e-sourcing platform that just does that. It might do a little bit of supplier onboarding and it might have somewhere where you can store contracts, but fundamentally it's a sourcing tool that does things like reverse auctions and sort of smart or electronic RFQs, RFPs, RFIs, request for quotation, request for proposal, request for information, as a best of breed tool rather than just doing it as part of an end-to-end suite. The advantage being the suites do a lot of things but don't do any of them particularly best in class. And nowadays with technology like APIs and having very open integratable software as a service rather than something that sits on a server, when everything's cloud-based and can be connected to one another, if you're thinking more simple SaaS, through something like Zapier, then it just makes it a lot easier to get those systems to speak to one another. MRO is maintenance, repair, and overhaul, which is essentially any sort of indirect, non-production spend that goes through a factory to support factory operations, but doesn't go directly into the manufactured product. So things like spare parts, oil and lubricants, PPE, that type of thing.
Okay, cool. This being, when you think of procurement, what is procurement? It's anytime any company buys anything. So it's like a huge part of all of the money that travels in the world. And for for the kind of like landscape assessment to be that, well, everyone below Fortune 500 kind of is just doing whatever they're doing. It's this unfathomable green field, unfathomable amounts of value just sitting waiting to be captured. That said, I can see why from the outside in it seems like Procuretech is super hot, like just popping, super hot. Tons of VC dollars, venture capital dollars flooding into it. A zillion, you like your website is a testament to how many solutions are popping up. You probably can't even keep it straight, and it's your domain expertise. Is that assessment correct? Is that assessment correct that, and especially post-COVID, it's got to be just bonkers right now?
It is, in the sense that it's a lot more bonkers than it was 5 years ago. But then if you look at a solutions map for Procuretech, and then you look at a solutions map for FinTech or MarTech, it's like night and day. We're just getting started. So yeah, I mean, the market is becoming increasingly more noisy, and it is difficult to keep on top of everything that's going on there. I like to think I've got a pretty good hold of what's going on in Europe, but if I went to the States and tried to get hold of their Procuretech ecosystem, especially the early stage startups, the bigger ones you tend to hear of, but the pre-seed startups, I've probably not even scratched the surface on the website because I'm not as connected to that ecosystem, not being based over there. But it is still very greenfield. And I think that below Fortune 500 companies, there are companies that have very mature procurement functions, but for the most part, they're still managing procurement through ERP, SharePoint, email, and Excel. And when you think that in most companies, especially in manufacturing companies, circa 60% of a company's revenue is spent on goods and services from external vendors, would you want to manage that in spreadsheets and in an ERP system that looks and feels like it was designed in the 1990s? I wouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. To what extent are the solutions that are emerging in this space, I would say, quote unquote, platform-tized? Like, Salesforce being a really good example. Like you said, the maturity in other spaces is just night and day. Like if you're a new entrant in sales tech, you wouldn't build yourself as an island completely isolated from everything else. You would immediately start thinking, how can I plug into Salesforce or, any of the other kind of like CRM pieces of software out there? What solutions are there out there right now that are platform-tized, at least to an extent, where, a smaller, scrappier startup can build itself as a barnacle on a whale?
Yeah, and it is happening, and Salesforce is a great example because we are seeing the Salesforceization a little bit in procurement tech. It started off with the two biggest procurement source to pay, source to contract suites, which are Coupa and SAP Ariba. They're the two that have the biggest market share, and they are now starting to go down that platform model. And I think that's really it's been an acknowledgement that they can't do everything that procurement teams are demanding now in that software, and it's also a recognition, perhaps indirectly, that their software is starting to age in terms of the tech stack that it's been built on, and there's only a certain amount that they can do to rectify that and stay relevant. So yes, the sort of platform concept is growing. I think the key question or the key thing that we will observe is, will they continue to be the platforms that companies tend to use or grow out from? Or will it be one of these, vendor master data, single source of truth type of platforms like a Tealbook or a Scoutbee or a Hicks? Or could it even be something completely different? There's a albeit much smaller startup called Père Angustin, French company, and they've gone very much down this sort of partners and alliances route right from the very offset of making their software easy to plug and play with other solutions. So as you can, Père Angustin is a procurement performance management software. So essentially it's a project management platform that pulls in other areas of the business to work on projects that impact cost or value in some way, be it pure play cost down opportunities or things like energy savings or TCO within manufacturing. And they've brought a lot of other procurement tech solutions into that ecosystem and made it compatible. So they work with a spend analytics platform, they work with an e-sourcing tool, and so on and so forth. So I do think that the platform approach will be the future. And one of the most eminent influencers in this space, a lady called Dr. Eloise Epstein from Kearney, very much is a proponent of that philosophy or that hypothesis. So I do think that is probably the way that we're going to go. But who will be the winners and who will emerge, I think, is still very much up for debate. And certainly Cooper and SAP have got the budgets to do it, but will they keep up in terms of does their software provide the base added value of what it does over and above some of the more nimble and agile players out there, which could essentially then be their downfall?
No. That's my belief. Like at some point I just have to assert my beliefs. No. The startups move so dang fast, and
right.
The old dogs, we've seen. Here's part of my theses in a lot of the industrial stuff that I'm seeing is it's a story I've seen play out before, because I worked in tech startups and I kind of saw how a lot of this shakes out. And it's on the one hand, the established players, have all of the chips, they have all of the advantages, but on the other hand, they don't have the speed. And I feel a little hubris in my opinions on some of this, because I've seen this play out so clearly before. And someone like Tealbook, who speaks this language of just rapidly moving and all this kind of stuff, it's just gonna win. I just have to believe that. I don't know if that's goes against the grain of I don't know if people agree. Do people agree with that? Is that a hubris take, or is that just a realistic take?
Well, I think you're right, and I think if you cast your mind back, in 2011, 2012, Cooper was cutting edge tech. They were the new kid on the block. They were the guys that were looking to take down Ariba, and they succeeded to a large extent in terms of taking a lot of market share from them. But now they're a publicly listed company, and they're a very corporate entity, and they're seen now, if not one of the dinosaurs, they're certainly one of the stalwarts. And they're not as innovative as they were, and they've become bloated as they've grown. The question is, will Tealbook become that? They're nimble and agile and hiring like crazy now, or any of these that are at the same. I think Tealbook Series B, maybe Series C, I'd have to check. Will they all go down the same fate, and will this always be like the circle of life in terms of there'll always be a new startup on the block that challenges them? I think that's, if you're someone like a Tealbook or at that level of funding that's scaling rapidly and growing and acquiring new customers really rapidly, at what point do you build up so much bureaucracy that you no longer become an agile, nimble startup that can do that? And I don't think they're there yet, but they're certainly in danger of becoming that, because it's something that hits every company at a certain point in time. When they grow. There are very few companies that have managed to resist that. If you look at perhaps Amazon and Apple being the great, Google perhaps as well, that as they've grown into being these big corporate monoliths, yes, they've got certain things that they're very bloated on, like legal, but they're still able to innovate and have these labs within these huge corporations. I think that's always going to be the challenge.
Yeah, I think my opinion on how to know exactly what's going to happen is look at AWS and how that conquered so much and how much resistance there was to it. In industrial conversations, I come across all these people who, have all the hesitations that people had about AWS, and eventually AWS just won. And so I think it's a really good blueprint for how those conversations will go over time. I've heard it repeated so often, but if you were going to use AWS's servers for your company, at one point people thought you were a little weird and crazy. And now if you don't use AWS's servers, they think you're crazy. So it's that story is going to play out. But yeah, the story
Yeah.
repeats. I mean, now AWS is slow, and you have DigitalOcean and Cloudflare and things like that cropping up, and I wouldn't bet against Cloudflare. So,
Yeah, it's this whole circle, isn't it? Which ones managed to scale to the point and still maintain a degree of innovation? And maybe I've been a bit unfair on Coupa. I certainly think they're more innovative than SAP.
yeah,
but,
and that's the thing. Oracle didn't go anywhere.
yeah.
I mean, they're a juggernaut, and that won't change.
And the other danger is, once companies have a certain amount of money, they then have the ability to go and buy up startups and just kill them if they see them as being a threat. And Coupa is now, staying on that example, actively investing in early stage procurement and supply chain tech startups. And the optimist in me hopes that it's to enable them to become more innovative as a larger entity, but the pessimist or the cynic in me says that maybe they're just doing it to kill them, because then they don't have to be as nimble, acknowledging the fact that they are this big corporate monolith now.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, so real quick, you did mention Dr. Eloise Epstein from Kearney, and I neglected to mention that you do have a podcast. And just to tell our listeners, go listen to that episode of the podcast with James and Dr. Eloise Epstein, because that was so informative. So just an aside to our audience to say, go listen to that. It was great. I learned a lot. You'll learn a lot. But on that note, during the podcast, you talked about how bigger players who haven't gotten into procurement have become acquisitive. So Microsoft and Workday, you called out, had made acquisitions in the space. What have some notable acquisitions been, first off? And then what are those acquisitions changing in the space?
Yeah, so Microsoft acquired a spend analytics company called Supplier, which were coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, also based in Seattle in 2021. Workday acquired a company called Scout RFP, which was an e-sourcing platform, also based in the San Francisco Bay Area. McKinsey acquired a spend analytics platform called Orpheus, and then there have been some smaller acquisitions of more generic software companies that have been expanding into Procuretech. There was a UK company, Advanced, that bought an Australian company called Port recently that was in the sort of spend analytics and source to contract space. Eska, who's a big French source to pay suite, acquired a company called Market Dojo, which is a best of breed e-sourcing, e-auction platform based in the UK. So the acquisition market is really hotting up. But we're not just seeing it through, big tech buying up Procuretech startups. We're seeing it in, more generic software companies gobbling up procurement tech, and also, some of the more established procurement tech providers acquiring smaller not competitors, but smaller companies that can add something to their platform. A great example of that was a really well-established German source-to-pay provider called Onventis. Acquired a small Swedish spend analytics platform called Spendency, because they had a pretty good solid piece of software, but the spend analysis or spend analytics offering that Onventis had was pretty much non-existent, and a lot of their customers evidently were asking for that, and they didn't really want to leave cash on the table by just having to refer them to a third party and maybe take a small commission from that. So it's happening all over, and I think we will continue to see more consolidation, and then more entrants will continue to come into the space. And like all things, the good ones will survive and float and get funding, and the ones that don't have their product and sales and development and funding licked will end up going the way of the dodo. It's like all areas of technology, I guess. I mean, I don't have a tech background. I'm a procurement guy, but you see it in pretty much every vertical in the tech space.
All right, so I just want to talk quick about suppliers. And with this landscape, and like you said, very quickly suppliers will not find it to be worth their time to update things in some database where it's someone else's single source of truth and nobody's using it and things like that. Are there any solutions for suppliers that are emerging where, maybe they update things in one place and it propagates out to a lot of other places? Like I saw this, for example, I saw this happen in music a lot where indie bands couldn't get listed on, iTunes and Spotify and all these places easily. And then a crop of startups showed up where you list it one place and it propagates everywhere. So is this going to get solved in some kind of a similar way at all?
You know what? That's maybe the best idea for a new startup, because I'm, other than these solutions that push the data that we've already mentioned, there's not anything that I'm aware of at the moment that you can upload your data to and then it syndicates it to all of these different vendor master data procurement tech platforms. So, I guess, like you say, the classic example is like if you publish a podcast, your hosting software will make sure that it syndicates to Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, Stitcher, whatever. There's not anything that I'm aware of right now that does that.
Okay, interesting. Well, my guess is that the vendor master databases all sell themselves as that, and they think of it in terms of first person. And so we're the only listing that matters. So just list on us,
Yeah.
So it's got to be somebody else.
Yeah, especially now. I mean, on ProcurementSoftware.site, I think we've got 24 vendor master data platforms in some form or another. Some of them are not pure play. They just offer that as an add-on. But, there's certainly about half of them would describe themselves as being essentially single sources of truth for vendor master data. So, yeah, I think as that market proliferates, unless it consolidates and there just becomes, 3 or 4 that really dominate the market, then it could be an issue. It's a bit like these e-invoicing platforms, isn't it? Going back a few years, that there were so many of them on the market that, if you were a sort of small or medium-sized business and you were dealing with large corporates that had this e-invoicing software, you'd have to register for about 10 of the bloody things because everyone used a different one.
So let's talk a little bit about suppliers then. If somebody were to want to go and build that, who are these suppliers? who are suppliers? How do you find them? How do you contact them? Where do they hang out?
It depends what they're
digitally
supplying.
Where do they hang out? So
it depends what you're supplying. I mean,
for sure.
Think about it. Let's think about it in the most simple terms. So if you're a freelance web developer, then you probably hang out on somewhere like Upwork or People Per Hour, or if you're lower end, then Fiverr. It's a little bit like that. You need to understand, okay, well, where are your potential customers going to find you, and once you know that, then that's where you need to be, and that may even be offline solutions like. If you make packaging machinery, then that you're probably going to get some good leads if you go to the International Packaging Machinery Expo in Düsseldorf, Germany every 2 years. It really depends on what you're supplying and what your customer acquisition strategy is.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about ESG. So let's say, environmental concerns or something like that. What's practically happening in this space right now?
So what's practically happening at the moment is that everyone is banging the drum saying that they're doing something or that they will do something, but the quality of the data and the sources and the ability to verify and validate that data is still very much in its infancy. So I think there's a lot of posturing and a lot of greenwashing going on, and a lot of companies virtue signaling that they're doing something, whereas in reality they're probably not really. Or if they are doing something, is it making an impact? Unlikely, because the data is still very immature and it's difficult to verify. Measuring carbon emissions is somewhat more advanced and somewhat easier, because certainly in the EU they've had carbon trading for a while, but some of the other stuff like social and governance. Well, who defines all of this? I think that's the danger, and that's the concern that I have with it. I think fundamentally, obviously people want to do good. I think people generally are more aware and want to make more informed buying decisions, certainly as a consumer. Of course I would want to buy local meat from my butcher rather than some industrial farmed garbage that's just propagated by some big multinational corporation. How do you go about ensuring that? And I think that's what we really don't know about. And that's what, this is going more into supply chain really rather than procurement, but that's what I think the companies that manage these supply chains haven't really got their head around yet. And if they say that they have, I would view that very skeptically.
Okay. Another thing I was curious about is I've heard it described that there's a knowledge imbalance between suppliers and buyers, where suppliers know quite a bit more about the supply than the buyers. And I was wondering if that power dynamic was shifting at all. There's a lot of best of breed, quote unquote, things that I think are exposing macro data to buyers about what are the conditions of what they're buying, like how's the supply and demand and pricing and all of that going globally and things like that. Is that power shifting?
Yeah, so I think sellers have always had more access to those sort of tools. So, sellers have always had more investment in people, processes, admin support, technology that facilitates that. So now with the price and the breadth of Procuretech that's available, and companies are realizing that they need to invest more money into understanding what they buy and the cost structure, especially in a very inflationary environment that we're seeing at the time that we're recording this. I think the penny has finally dropped that, if you're spending all of your money chasing after the hottest girl in school, which is, sales and revenue, but you're not spending it on looking at, where the holes are in your bucket in terms of where that's leaking out with suppliers overcharging you or maybe sourcing something at unfavorable conditions. That is changing. I think technology is changing that through it maturing, through there being more solutions available, and just the price of it coming down, as well as the penny dropping in the boardroom that if we're spending 60% of our revenue on goods and services from external vendors, then we kind of need to know how the costs are made up. But I think, yes, you're right that historically, yes, salespeople have been better equipped with data than buyers have been, and that has hamstrung us in terms of how we're able to negotiate, especially when the power balance is in the seller's favor. If it's something that's more of a bottleneck good or service where there's not a multitude of suppliers that you can buy from, and it's not a commoditized market.
Winding down to the last couple of questions, in this world, which is so complex in terms of the supply chain craziness that's gone on, I've heard of a lot of potential problems for a lot of industries that, like, where raw materials will become scarce over the long term, or where some critical component, like we saw with chips and auto manufacturing, some critical component that people didn't pay much mind to will grind things to a halt. And like a concrete example, I was listening to this whole podcast where someone said there's going to be a global shortage of battery separator film. So like we're making all of these lithium ion batteries. The batteries need separator film, and there's going to be a global shortage and nobody's accounting for it. And all of these huge multinational conglomerates are going to hit a brick wall in terms of wanting to make what they're going to make, because there's going to be a critical component missing. Now, I don't know if any of that is true or whatever, or if you even can forecast it out. But how do these companies think about these like longer term risk things? Now, this is a procurement risk. So how do they think about risk, not in like the short term, but in a longer term, like strategic for their business? And what tools do they have at their disposal to navigate this? Is it just whoever is running the company needs to make strategic choices and they work out or they don't? Or like, is there a more controlled way that these companies can assess these types of risk?
So I would disagree with you that it's a procurement problem.
Okay.
It's a whole company problem.
Yeah.
Because if if the company can't make product, it can't sell product, it doesn't make a profit, and that means everyone's not got a job. So it's a procurement, and it's a problem that procurement and supply chain are ultimately responsible to fix. But I would challenge whether it's a procurement problem, and I'll tell you why. Procurement historically has reported to the CFO, and CFOs are often, surprisingly, not always the most commercially literate of people, in that they're very often just chasing after short-term savings, because in the case of publicly traded companies, they have to report back to the stock market every quarter in the US, every year in most other countries. So their objectives for procurement have traditionally been hard cost savings. So procurement were essentially targeted with taking cost out of the business and pretty much nothing else. Now, what things like COVID and the Ever Given Suez Canal issue and now war in Ukraine and disrupted supply chains, what it's shown us is that this short-term thinking is no longer sufficient. But to get beyond that and to get procurement yearns not to be just measured on cost savings. I say that as a procurement professional that was pretty good at finding savings and delivering targets, but I always used to get frustrated that if I'd sourced a spare part that lasted twice as long, or invested in or bought some machinery and equipment that was 10% more energy efficient, the plant manager would get recognized for that saving, not me. So there has to be a more joined up way of how we measure value within a company to be able to address that type of problem. And I can't speak of that specific example. I don't know the ins and outs of that commodity, but you can take the same logic into pretty much any good or service. That marketing is a great example. You can't go and source a marketing agency just based on cost, because you'll get a pretty useless marketing agency. I'm sure Apple doesn't source their marketing based on a lowest price evaluation criteria. So it's all about recognizing wider value, and how you do that will never be perfect. There will always be someone that can play the system or play the way that targets are put together. But having a more joined up thinking and having procurement targets set along with a factory's production targets, or with logistics, or with sales and marketing's targets, to me just makes perfect sense, because we're not in a silo and we are part of the wider business.
So in the content I've seen out there about procurement, this kind of sentiment is something I've heard echoed a lot, that procurement needs to transcend just being about cost savings. The cynical reaction to that would be to take that the current state of affairs still today is that it oftentimes is, if not very, very, very often, is reduced to just cost savings, to the detriment of the organization as a whole over the long term. Is that cynical take kind of true? Like, unfortunately, even still today, it is usually kind of just about cost savings?
I mean, it will always be the justification of increasing your headcount in procurement, in the procurement are the custodians of cost within the business. And I think that will always be the case, but there is a gradual move, especially in more progressive organizations, to understand that procurement can deliver so much more than cost savings. And that if you take it to its logical conclusion, if you target a procurement team with saving 5% every year, at some point your suppliers will no longer make a profit, or they'll just find their way to hide costs somewhere else that's not being measured. So it has to happen, because once you get past the basic low-hanging fruit of taking cost out, the real value drivers are things like innovation, supplier collaboration, R&D with long-term partner suppliers that can really drive your business forward.
All right. Well, I've taken quite a bit of your time. I really appreciate you guesting here and sharing your knowledge with us. Any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with about Procuretech as a whole from your kind of bird's eye view?
The one thing I would say is you don't need a six-figure budget and an army of consultants anymore to go out and buy procurement software. If you're listening to this, maybe as a CIO, or maybe as a CFO or CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing company, for a relatively modest five-figure sum, you can go out and buy Procurementech, and you don't really need anyone to install it. If you've got a good procurement tech vendor that can, walk you through what you need to do, then, if it's SaaS and if it's cloud-based, you don't need to integrate it with anything unless you choose to integrate it with your ERP system. And, your IT people should be able to do that internally anyway. So, these things don't need days or weeks of training anymore. Literally, in most cases, if you go with the more user-friendly ones, you can use it within a day.
All right. Well, if folks want to find out where to start, I think ProcurementSoftware.site is a fine place to start. So head on there and check out the software listings, check out the podcast, check out the blog. Lots of great content, and we really appreciate you putting all that great knowledge out there for everyone. So
no,
thank
appreciate
you so much,
Kevin, and thank you for the opportunity to come on and spread the word. It's a rapidly growing marketplace and a huge untapped area of opportunity. So yeah, if procurement has been the redhead stepchild in your organization, then it's definitely somewhere where you can uncover some value pretty quickly.
All right. Thank you so much. ProcurementSoftware.site. Thanks a lot for joining us, James.
Thanks, Kevin.